Bill Brodhead, I did supposedly retired a couple years ago, but that doesn't work very long for me. So I've been down in my basement doing all kinds of things, and is it just it clicks it? And working with different companies on some instruments, and there's a really great one that's out of Canada that's a sniffer that I played around with. We used at the training centers, and then Radon has their sniffer, and then there's a new one called the Eco Trackers from EcoSense. So I was like, let's put these to the test and see how they do. And so when I put things to the test, it ends up taking 3 months of futzing around and testing with them. So let's go through this. If I can, do I point this some way? Help me. Do I push the right? Oh, there we go. So why should you have a radon sniffer? Well, there's a lot of good reasons for that. One, obviously, could be a floor drain, could be a utility pipe. Is it a problem? I've had houses, we went in the past, and I went back and I was like, oh, it's the pipe going out to the well, okay? And it wasn't until I sniffed that I suddenly discovered that was the issue. And if you've been to my class, I talk about all kinds of crazy things with conduits and things coming in. So the other thing with sniffers is trying to figure out where the source is. So a sniffer that can measure small differences, radon diffuses rapidly. It's a pain in the butt to try and stop it, but it's also a pain in the butt to expect that it's going to be different on the left side of the room than the right side. It's just the diffusion is very rapid. So we need a special instrument for that. Trying to locate a radon source, especially along the top of a foundation wall, because often we get radon that comes in from the adjoining slab. So that's an issue, and it's not easy to locate that. Okay? Measuring radon levels below the slab. I haven't done a lot of that, but some of the mitigators, so Matt Koch, he likes to go down and measure and find, wow, we got a really hot spot here. And it may be a situation where you need to determine most of the radon's coming from this area. But I warn you about that. When you do those kind of measurements, sometimes the highest level is where the least amount of radon's coming into the house, which is the center of the slab. So, all these have to be taken into consideration when you're doing that. Measuring radon flux coming through concrete. I did a couple papers on that down in Florida and North Carolina where we had radon coming out of the concrete, okay? And what's happening, these buildings are really airtight. And I just, in the research I did on this one, we found a basement and it was 0.15 air changes, which is supposed to be 0.3. So houses are getting tighter all the time. And as they get tighter, we're going to have issues. And if we ever want to go to a standard of 2.7, we're going to have to really think about small sources like what comes through the concrete. Maybe we can use it for helping our mitigators when they're out there. We can measure the radon exposure after ventilation. So can we use a sniffer to quickly determine that the guys are being exposed or their exposure has been reduced when we open or run fans to ventilate? And then we can also use these sniffers sometimes for measuring radon in water by putting them in the bathroom, run the shower and everything in there. And some of the instruments can even measure thoron. Okay, so go back. So I had to have a calibrated chamber in order to do the testing, and so I have this chamber set up. Fortunately, through Pennsylvania DEP, they had an old chamber. They gave it to me. I reworked it, and they gave me a source, and we got it all running. And obviously, it takes a lot of effort to get all this. But is it correct? So we sent off 4 of the EcoSense radon eye kind of monitors, Eco Trackers, off to Bowser-Moorner, and they were all, this is the reading in Bowser-Moorner chamber, and we were within 1 or 2%. So I was really pleased. The instruments do really well when we put them against a chamber source. So what do we have for instruments? We have 3. We have the Radon Away GM12. It measures up to 1,000, so if you're measuring below the slab, you can often go over 1,000. So it will tend to blow out, and that was one of the issues with it. It measures the average every 6 minutes, and so that's the amount of time it needs. And how well does it do? Well, when I measure the chamber, it would record within about 70 to 80% of the radon levels in the chamber in 6 to 12 minutes. So the good thing is, yes, it's definitely measuring and picking up radon levels, and I'll show some results from that. I then move it for 12 minutes outside in a low radon area, and it tends to read 10 to 25% of the original sample. So if you expose it to 400 picocuries, you're going to have a reading of 40 picocuries or 60 picocuries outside for quite a while to cool it down. If you only expose it to a low level. And this is one of the things with all sampling, when you're doing sniffing, you have to hope that you're not going to hit the hottest spot first. Well, maybe that's good, then you figured it out and you can say that's it. But if you use, you always start from the lowest, what you expect to be the lowest, and then move towards what you expect to be the highest so that you can still use it to make other measurements. It erases all the previous data. That was the one downside with this unit. It does not store data. So you have to keep remembering to go back. Oh, it's been 6 minutes and you're off doing something and you miss a reading because it's constantly popping up a new reading every 6 minutes, but you'll lose it because it erases them. It doesn't have any graph function, and the newer ones do have graph functions. So, and that can be very helpful for seeing the change of radon as you go through. You can't download any data, and its sensitivity is about 0.175 counts per minute. So it's the lower sensitivity of the two other instruments. So this is a unit from Canada. It's a scintillation cell, kind of like our old pylons, but he combined it into a small unit. The brains of it is your cell phone. So it Bluetooths to your cell phone. And that's great, other than when you walk out of the room, you lose your Bluetooth connection if you leave it in the room. So you have to keep remembering, don't walk too far away from it. You lose your Bluetooth connection to it. It prints out graphs, and it also gives you, it doesn't print the graphs, but displays graphs on your phone, of which you can take screenshots. So a lot of times I would do a quick screenshot. And it also displays the 15-second rolling average and the 5-minute average. So what's great, measures really high radon. You can measure under the slab. If you're measuring really high, you want to get that measurement and pull it out before it contaminates the cell, background counts on the cell. So that 15 seconds really handy if you hit something really high. The 15 second is worthless for measuring 8 picocuries. It's too short of a time thing, but it has a 5-minute rolling average, okay? It recorded much closer. This instrument was the most accurate of all of them as far as actually measuring. We were 90 to 100% of the radon levels. You know, you're measuring over these 5-minute intervals. So this one did really well that way. And when I moved it outside, it has an algorithm to reduce the, to calculate the background and subtract it out, but I was still getting pretty high, 10 to 30% of the original sample, and you'll see that in the chart. You'll notice that it's jumping up. It's a little hard to read, but we're reading 20 picocuries on its peak. And so looking at the chart, and radon levels are fluctuating all the time, you can then see that, oh, that 20, it's running about 20, move it outside, it's running about 2.5, 3 or 4 picocuries. I did it again, and then the second time it didn't drop as much, but you have that chart to kind of see what's going on. The other really cool thing with it is on the bottom of that chart is a little slider bar, and you can slide the averaging. You can average it from 15 seconds all the way up to 360 seconds or longer. So by changing the average, you smooth out that rise and fall. So very handy feature. Once you get used to using it, it's great. So we really like the graph feature on it. And I tended to use the graph feature a lot more than the counts on it, or the averages, because I can see what's happening on it. You can't download data from it, but you can do screenshots, and it will do long measurements. And where the other one was 0.17 counts per minute per picocurie, this is 0.78. So this is the highest sensitivity. And it also has a thoron function. I talked to the owner and I said, hey, the manufacturer, I said, hey, can you make it read thoron? And so he's put in a thoron function. I'm going to work with him some more on that. And it works by pumping air and then turning the pump off. And then it waits for 5 minutes. And if the counts all start disappearing, it then does the algorithm to figure out, wow, that must be thoron because it's disappearing so rapidly on there. So that's a great thing. Okay? EcoSense is basically, they're just the radon eyes. But having used them over the years, I was talking to the guys and said, you know, these could be sniffers. And if you just put a shorter time sequence than 60 minutes. And so they did that. They developed a whole one. They call it the Eco Tracker. And they put in 5-minute averages. and produce a chart. So you get that chart, which is really cool because it's giving you a similar thing to the Canadian unit. And you can see the rise of radon, the fall, the rise, and it displays the averages on your phone. It also is Bluetooth, so you got to stay connected to it with the Bluetooth. It runs in the same issues. This one doesn't measure, measures up to 255, so it's the lowest one in measurement. So this one would not be appropriate if you're hitting something really high. You put it right in a sump pump, and you know it's going to be 1,000 picocuries in there. It's going to peg this thing, and then the higher you go, and the length of time you have it in there will determine how much background it gets and how long it takes to get back to a unit that'll read lower levels. It does 5-minute averages, 10-minute averages, or hourly averages. So you can also leave in it overnight. So you leave it there, come back the next day, and you'll have, it stores all the data inside. Okay? It was the lower of the 3 units, so it's reading 60 to 70% of the radon levels. So you need to take that into consideration. I don't think they made modifications of it to take in the last polonium, so it's missing that last polonium. It's seeing the first polonium, and it's seeing radon in the first polonium. So, but what I found, which was great, was I tried it on 5-minute and 10-minute, and it was actually doing quite well at 5 minutes. So the first 5-minute reading was in that 60%, 70%. The second 5-minute was close to that. So that meant, hey, you could expose these for a short amount of time. And that's important. When you're exposing something, you don't want to build up too much background with these. You would pull it outside, and actually it dropped pretty well. They were dropping down to 10 to 14% of the original sampling level. Once again, if you have something high, you're gonna pick up some background from that, and then you move it to the next area, and you have to take that in consideration. But I told them they needed to, when they market a bunch of them, because you want to be able to, what's really nice, be able to see the variation. Is it higher in that room than this room? Is it higher next to the utility pipe versus the center of the room? You know, and you get that variation, and you let it run for a while, and we'll see an example of that. It also has a graph display. You can download the data to this. So this one, if you left it overnight, you can download the data, and it'll download the data as 5 minutes or 10-minute averages or 60-minute averages, depending on how you set it. It has a sensitivity that's halfway between the other 2 units. And it must be plugged in. That's one downside with it. However, they give you a converter plug, and you can take a cell phone battery, plug that in, use the converter that changes it to the 12 volts it needs, and run it on that. So a lot of times I'm moving it around and got a little battery with it, you know, because I don't want to bother plugging it in. And as a mitigator, if I'm going back to a problem house, time's the essence. I got to go, and I want to measure as many locations, sometimes 8 locations, you know, at that one house. And so I want to be able to move it around and not have to drag cords around. So one of the things that's difficult, I've found, is that frickin' radon diffuses so rapidly. And so you get a source, like an adjoining slab for a garage, front porch. You know that that slab is close to the wood of the sill plate. There could be radon moving into the basement from that sill plate. And so we can spread these out and leave them in there. Or you can take, and I don't show a picture of this, you can take one of the 2 other sniffers and slowly work along. But when you're working those, you're waiting for the gas to get into the chamber and then have enough counts that it looks significant and look at small differences. Whereas if you have more monitors, you can spread them out. And then the question is, how fast does it diffuse? And so I set up an experiment where we pumped 175 picocuries of radon at 20 liters per minute out of the white tape to the right side of that lower pitcher. So the small red arrow is 175 picocuries moving at 20 liters per minute. That's very low. That's about 0.7 CFM. So it's a fairly low flow. Okay? I put 12 of these monitors in for a whole day to see, well, what would the average reading be? And the radon levels from that amount did raise my basement from 2.5 picocuries to about 4. And when I was done, we got this pattern. And the very top of the slide is the radon coming out of this small tube. And the plume, corrugated kind of area is the plume. And what was interesting was the radon monitors on both sides, and even at a 45-degree angle, were background. Exactly the same as the basement, very little difference. And it was only as it was exposed to the plume, and the plume was like egg-shaped, where it kind of went out, didn't even hit the 45s, it just missed them, and then once it lost its velocity, kind of spread a little bit to the side, and then went into this kind of shape. So we started at 15 picocuries for the first, then 10, then 7, then down to 7, and then the very top of it was down to 5, whereas the basement was running 4.6, 4.4, 4.4, 4.3, and all around. So it is difficult to find a source of something that's just coming out at you. And so when we're doing sill plates, we're often looking, where can I see airflow? Can I see discoloration of the fiberglass? Can I see a split in the wood? You know, or is there some place that would be a source to put your monitor as close to that source as possible, or your sniffer? So we went out and did this at a case study house. And this house had started off at 17, and it came back at 5.5. And so I said, well, let's go out and see what the sniffers were doing. And the lower basement is on the left side, and the right side is actually an upper basement. So it's a double level basement, okay? And it turned out the mitigator had only put in systems for the lower basement. And when I checked the vacuum, we had good vacuum. We had 30 pascals under the floor of negative pressure, so no issue there. He had tried block wall suction, that hadn't worked. And so I put the ETs represent a eco tracker next to the washer dryer in the lower. Then we have an eco tracker up top at the upper level. And then I had one next to a floor drain. And we put an eco tracker next to a crawl space there to try and check it. I also checked it neutral pressure in the place. It's always a good idea when you have a problem house. Are we dealing with some extra pressures that are overpowering my radon system? And what's that? Are we okay? So what's important to do when you get out there? Most important thing is check your pressure field underneath the floor. We always get the drill. We have portable drills, portable vacuums, and we do our pressure reading underneath. Then we spread the eco trackers out, and we get those readings. So what happened with eco trackers? It saw a 2 picocurie difference between the crawl space entrance and the utility room in the lower basement. And over the floor drain, woo, went sky high. And then as we walked over, went down again. So we knew the floor drain could be an issue, or that could be an issue. So recommended some changes, and I don't need to go through those. Second house. We had a house that had very high radon levels. I reported it before. And so we went through those and decided we needed to figure out what we can do to reduce the levels further, because they were coming in at 5, and the homeowner wanted it down to 3. And so there were 2 things: radon coming out of the floor, and we could stop that. We had good vacuum, or bring in an air-to-air heat exchanger. For the when we did the flux measurement on the floor, we had radon coming through the floor, and we tried to stop it with radon seal, and we got no change from the radon seal. So we went to air-to-air heat exchangers, and we found that if we turn the air exchanger on during the day, when the radon levels were lowest outdoors, we could reduce the radon level in there 1 or 2 picocuries and get it below the guidance, below the 4 picocurie level. If we ran it at night, we had radon levels at night that would go as high as 8 to 9 picocuries at night. And the interesting thing was that the radon levels on the porch and the radon levels at grade were the same at night. That 10-foot difference didn't make no difference on the radon levels. In other words, when it's high here, it's high even at 10 feet. When you get elevated radon outdoors, especially at night when there's no wind, there's no variation. So what are our conclusions? Sniffers measure radon levels, but they tend to measure lower levels, 60%. Some of them will get higher. When you move the unit outdoors, it's going to read 10 to 30% of the previous measurements, so you need to take that into consideration before you move it back into a new location. Sniffers will measure thoron, but thoron is, usually if there's thoron, there's radon, so, but all the instruments measure thoron, and if it's almost picocurie for radon, so if there's 100 picocuries of thoron, you're going to get 100 picocuries, you're going to think you have 100 of radon, so thoron's an issue. The plume is, from a directional source, is elongated. Doing multiple area testing at the same time sometimes you can see differences as small as 2 picocuries, but anything less than that's going to be difficult to see. Subslab reading you can do with the CTR if you consider thoron. That would be one place where you definitely need to think about thoron because you could be totally fooled. I've had houses that had 10 times more thoron than radon in the soil outside the building. So the graph functions are really handy when you're doing these. And sniffers, of course, are great for measuring pipes, drains, and cracks. And you do need an instrument that pulls air, and the 2 of the monitors pull air, so they're good for measuring block walls and being able to measure 1,000 picocuries. So with that, I don't know if there's questions or we can move right on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it is working. Okay, good. Does anybody have any questions for Bill real quick? We could take 1 or 2 questions. We're just a little bit behind, but I think it's important enough that if somebody's got a question, we get it answered. Microphone right behind you, sir. Thank you.
Bill, you had mentioned that the EcoSense can measure 60 to 70% of the chamber radon level in 5 minutes. How much better does it do at a 10-minute interval versus the 5?
It didn't get that much better with 10-minute intervals. You know, I mean, when you get out to the next polonium, you're talking about almost an hour of half-life on there. So really, and mostly you're looking comparatively on there, but it's just important to realize your sniffers may be under-measuring what you're doing. There's a full paper I'm writing on the whole thing, and I'll have that on my website, and we'll also have it on the ARS website at some point, so you can refer back to the full paper describing all the details.
Yeah, that's perfect. I was just going to ask that question if that was available yet. In another week or so, huh?
Yeah.
Good deal. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it very much.
Yep.